There we go. All right, you with me? Okay, so the problem that we're trying to describe here is how temp IDs are meant to work, and what can go wrong with them with the kind of the default setup that you get with plain Fulcro. And I think did I pull in the EQL namespace here? Yeah, I did. Okay, so I wanted to start by just describing the general functionality and a little bit of history, really, because Fulcro predates Pathome, and in fact, Fulcro predates mutation joins being in EQL, and so this is part of the reason why this hasn't gotten completely straightened out, possibly in the documentation and in the code base. Is I just haven't gone back and readdressed this particular concern. So let's just do a quick little like ASCII table here of EQL and response, right? So if you ask for X, then you'll get some response with X and some value in it. If you run a mutation, you'll get a map that has that mutation symbol in it, and whatever the mutation returns, and it's generally recommended you return something that an entire query would return. So a map is typically what you'd want to return, but you could return nil. Whatever the mutation returns is what the built-in Fulcro middleware and transaction processing will attach in this map. And of course, if you had two functions in here, you know, a second one maybe with params, then you get a map that has, you know, the result of G under the G symbol and the result of F under the F symbol. Is that, you follow all that?
Yes.
Okay. So in classic pre-Pathome, you know, probably back in the untangled days, this is all mutations could do, is they could return some blob of data, some just arbitrary value of data, and you had to write in your see now, where would it be? In the really old versions, there, you know, before I modified how mutations work, where you could make an OK action block and a default result action block and a result action block, all that stuff. That's Fulcro, I think 3 is when that stuff came in. So prior to that, you actually had to go into the middleware a bit to mess with these mutation return values, and actually install some things in the middle to get to them. So it wasn't very convenient. And EQL didn't even have the ability to say what the shape of the thing was. And so you didn't have a way to indicate for a mutation that the thing being returned was a graph and that you wanted to normalize it, right? So it's kind of a big hole. So when we added mutation joins to the EQL, right, the idea here was you could make a join and use the function call as the key of the join, right? Just like you could for regular EQL, you make a join and then you make a subquery, right? So the idea was, all right, well, this is the key to the join. It's you run the function and then the function returns, well, let's make that Y, some subquery, right? So that was the thing that we added to EQL. And of course, Pathome supports this and understands it and can send you a subgraph. So after the mutation runs, what Pathome does is it runs the mutation, and then it looks at the return value and reprocesses, or I guess you could call it reprocesses, or processes the mutation join query based on that value, right? So if you said I'm calling add person and I want to get back person ID and person name and, you know, all the details of person, the function add person can return just the person ID, and then Pathom will fill in the query just like it does for a normal query, right? So it's like it starts over, but with the context of I have a person ID map with a number in it, and I need to also find person name. So it'll go and run the resolvers and fill in person name and follow other joins and so on and so forth. And of course, Fulcro, if this query is generated from a component, the query will have the ident metadata at each level of the joins in that follow-on query in that mutation join query. And so it can normalize it into your database. So this kind of unifies the entire system, right? Before you could only do that with regular reads, and now you can do a write and have the write return a value that acts just like you did a regular read, right? Now, there's another piece in here that you need to understand to get where things kind of go south. So in older Fulcro, pre-Pathom, where you were writing kind of these responses and parsers and so on and so forth yourself, a mutation, and let's go back to just this add person, could return a temp IDs map. And in here, you're basically saying there's an old ID, there's a new ID. And when you do that, Fulcro automatically would look for that special key, and it's got a namespaced version as well. The non-namespaced version is what most people use and what I still use, actually, because it's just such an odd key to worry about colliding on. But there's a namespaced version as well if you want. The idea was you want to be able to create something that has a client assigned ID that may not be what the server needs to give it. And so you want there to be a seamless way for that ID to propagate back from the server to the client and have the client operate properly with it. I'll talk about that here in just a minute. But where we ran into the issue, and the thing that causes people headaches, is that if you combine this with a mutation join now, and the function returns a temp IDs key, but you don't have temp IDs in your query, Pathom filters it out, right? Because Pathom said, well, you didn't ask for temp IDs. So even though the function gave me temp IDs and it also gave me person ID, 42, I'll go run the parser, the resolvers, and figure out how to get you the person name map. And so back at the client, you're going to get a map that has, sorry, this is the response. You're going to get a map that just says person ID, person name, right? Because you didn't ask for the name either. The function return person ID 42, you get Bob. And that's all you get, because Pathom's filtering out the temp ID. So even though your server-side mutation returns temp ID's key, Pathom filters it out. So there really are two fixes to this. One is every one of your components that does server interactions that you want to use as a return value includes temp IDs in its query. That's a pain. Who wants to do that? Or you can hook into Fulcro's middleware and ask it to add temp IDs to mutation return value queries at the middleware layer, so that you don't have to worry about it. It just, quote, works. That brings up another nuance, though, is if I've got a mutation I call, and I don't specify a return value, and you have it add just temp IDs here, but the function returns some other value you expect. Having temp IDs here will cause Pathom, again, to process the result, filter it down to temp IDs, and strip out value. So you kind of need, if you change the middleware in Fulcro to say, when I send a mutation, always include temp IDs in the response, then you have to be careful about the mutations that don't ask for mutation join, because if you add a subquery onto those, Pathom will filter it. Right.
So that's kind of inconsistency between how Pathom behaves based on whether you specify the mutation join or not. Because if you have not specified it, it gives you everything.
It gives you everything, right? Which was the default Fulcro behavior. That's the way Fulcro's whole system worked prior to version, I don't know, whatever. And so for backward compatibility, If you don't specify mutation join, you just get everything the mutation returned, and there's no post-processing of the mutation return value. But as soon as you start adding a query, well, now you're getting post-processing on the server side and the client side of that query. And so you have to make sure that that query is correct. And so I went over here and took the RAD demo and intentionally broke it to show this problem. So normally the application in RAD hooks in this hack that I was talking about. This global EQL transform is the key that you can configure on the application that says, when you see EQL going out, I want to look at it and potentially manipulate it before it goes out so that I can affect the communication between the server and the client in a global way. The default EQL transform for Fulcro doesn't play with mutation joins at all. And so we could consider that a bug. Probably we should move this global EQ. We should change the default global EQL transform to handle this mutation issue, because I think people are running into it when they start playing with Fulcro and they start trying to use temp IDs and they also use mutation joins. They end up in this place where the default for what's in the global transform is just wrong for what they're doing. And so if you don't have the global EQL transform and you go to create something new, let's get Joe, normal user, time zone, joe@example.com, right? And if we go and look in the database here, we've got a new user here that, it's created, a nice form here. But when we go to save this, we look at the network interaction. Let me clear this. We save and we see the save form goes across, which is a built-in thing, and it's a mutation join. And here's the subquery, and it's asking for all the account data. It's asking for all the account data back from the account, all the files they've uploaded, all their addresses, etc. And the idea here is that when you're editing something, so there's a bunch of different little nuances here I have to explain so that things make sense. When you're editing a form, Fulcro's form state always sends a minimum diff. Now, this was a new one, so it sent everything. But if I had just edited the name of this person and you had edited their user type, and we were in there at the same time, we're in a distributed system. So the picture I've got on my browser and the picture that you got in your browser may differ, and the fields that I edit on my browser and the fields that you edit on your browser may differ. And so there's kind of two ways to handle this. Either when it's sort of the JSON-y REST way where you just send the entire thing every time, right? And last write wins, right? So you change the user's name and I change the user's, you change the user, whatever. We change name, age. I save first. I modify the name, but I resave age. You save second. All you've changed is age, but you had the old version of name in your browser. So it sent the old version of name and it undoes my change.
Yep.
That's kind of a crappy behavior. So form state, when I wrote it 5 years ago or 6 years ago or whatever, the idea there was that what I'll do is send a diff that's normalized. We already have normalized kind of concepts in Fulcro. Let's just normalize a diff and send just what changed. So when I change name, I'll send just name changed. When you change age, you'll send just age changed. And yes, it's a distributed system. I won't see your age change yet, but you'll see my name change if, when you save age, I reload what's in the server so you get the most up-to-date picture. So I'm going to see an older version on my browser of the person with the older age, but that was a consistent picture at the time I wrote. And you're going to see a picture of the person at the time you wrote, but you'll see the name updated, right? And so this isn't quite, I mean, we're not doing WebSockets and synchronization and subscriptions and watching transaction logs and this, all that complicated mess, but it's a reasonable approximation for what most people do, right? For that rare case where both of you are editing something at the same time, you don't want to stomp on each other's changes unless you both change the exact same fact. If you changed Bob to Bobby and I changed Bob to Robert, last save wins, right? What else can we do? Well, we could do optimistic concurrency where we send the basis T of the database or use a CAS operation and say, that the number of transactions I've run against this person since the beginning of time, right? We could store that on each entity, and we get optimistic concurrency where the save could say, nope, I didn't save yours because somebody else saved before you, and then you could fix it, right? That's the other thing you could do. But either way, you're going to want to read after the mutation, you're going to want to read what's in the database, right? You're going to want to know what was there in the mutation join. So this form is doing that. When I save, you see it saves, here's all the data that I input. And then it's asking down here in the mutation join, here's all the stuff I should get back. And you'll notice in here, since I've broken it, there's no temp IDs, even though the mutation on the server returns temp IDs. And the reason is the query, right, didn't ask for it. And so I didn't get it in the response either. And therefore, if I go look in the database, the temp ID didn't rewrite. Unfortunately, the temp ID didn't rewrite, but because it returned the data, it normalized that in there. So now I have 2 copies of Joe in my app state database. So it's hosed, right? That's actually broken. Let me talk a minute about, I did want to mention why we want temp IDs, because a question came up in the channel and it's a perfectly valid, good question. Why don't I just use global UUIDs, assign them on the client, and just ignore rewrites altogether, right? Just this temp ID stuff, it's kind of a hassle. I'm doing these rewrite things. If I just assign a stable ID for a new thing on the client and send that over the network to the server and have the server use it, then doesn't this fix it? So let's talk through that. The first thing that you have to be concerned about is that if you're using a constant ID type, you don't know whether or not the thing you're editing has been saved on the server or not, unless you create your own flag to track that. Right. So at the bare minimum, right. So let's talk about the GUID case, right? So at the bare minimum, requires you track, client side, what is, unsaved. And that just isn't a diff of, for things that you loaded from the server and are editing, you can look at the diff and see if you've saved, right? That's a good enough indicator. But for brand new things, you don't necessarily know that new thing, you might have had a new thing you create that has a bunch of default values and the user's like, oh yeah, I like all the default values. The diff isn't a perfect indicator, right? You still end up wanting a flag of, have I sent that to the server and has the server responded with a thing saying, yep, I got it. So that's going to have to be tracked. And if that's being tracked, then in every single operation that you do that needs that tracking, you're going to have to write logic that marks it, this is new. And then after the success of the server, marks it as, okay, it's saved, right? So that's primarily the issue. And then you can accidentally close over that new marker in weird ways that trip you up later, right? Because that new marker isn't automatically, atomically fixed for you at kind of the network layer. So for example, let's say that you're embedding in the parameters of mutations this entity with its new marker. And so you call, mutation A with the entity and then mutation B with the entity. And you do that second one before you got the response from the server that changed the new flag. Well, now the parameters that you closed over in that second call to that mutation have the wrong value for the new flag. And if that was a remote request, if that was a full stack request, that's sitting in a network queue somewhere, or even worse, you sent it asynchronously and it's actually like queued up in the browser's event thing where you can't even touch it, right? Or it's already started as a network request, right? So there's all sorts of ships passing in the nights because this is distributed systems, right? So let me kind of like give the example here. So if I run, create person, this is like the easiest way to think about it, or save person, and this is like some new person. and then I run let's say the user has clicked save and they're on a slow network or there's some network problems. And so save person has been queued on the network. And perhaps it's even started on the server, but the server's really busy. And so it's not got a thread yet. So you're connected to the server. As far as Fulcro can tell, it's told the server what the mutation is, but the server is so clogged it hasn't actually assigned CPU to that thread yet. So nothing's happened with respect to that on the server. While that's held up, you did an optimistic mutation that told the user, I'm saving that. Maybe you just said, it's saved. I just sent it and forget it, it's saved. And they've got access to a button that lets them delete that person. And they're going to send that same person over there. Now with the GUID case, you're probably okay here because as long as delete's an idempotent operation, well, you're not necessarily okay here, right? There's another thing that Fulcro does for you that helps solve another problem here. In a normal kind of async JavaScript app, if you're writing it by hand, what people do is they use things like the AJAX calls and just send these things right the second they happen, right? So I click the save button and then they say, oh no, I didn't mean to do that. They click the delete button. I'm queuing up two separate AJAX calls. They're running in parallel, right? They're competing to see who wins first, right? You've just created a nightmare situation where it doesn't even matter if these things are idempotent, because if this thing starts on the server and gets processed, and even if it's idempotent, the thing's not there. There's nothing to delete. So you sent the delete. You probably even optimistically removed it from their UI. Now they navigate away and come back 3 days later, and the thing that they thought they deleted is there, right? So that's a potential problem. So one of the things that Fulcro does for you by default, most people have probably already noticed this, is there's a send queue per remote. And by default, it's sequentially processed. Right. So I do the save person, and now this guy is waiting on the client. But it's in a queue, right? It is in a queue in Fulcro's internals. So you don't have easy access to that.
Wait, so I thought that the remote actions are triggered in order, but we don't wait for the first to finish before we trigger the next one.
Optimistic side, the optimistic side of these runs as soon as they're triggered. So save person, the optimistic side right away, delete person, optimistic side right away. Those are done, right? But as far as the network goes, save person is causing delete person to wait on the client. It hasn't hit the network yet.
Okay, so it actually waits until the first one returns.
Absolutely.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. There's a little bit of confusion in Fulcro 2. There was a thing called pessimistic mutations. And there's still things like post mutations for loads, right? There are ways of saying, I want this thing to run after that thing finishes. The trick is those were all for the optimistic action. I don't even want to run the optimistic action. I want to wait to run the optimistic action until the full stack operation is returned, right? So yeah, it's easy to get confused here, because if I do these two operations, actually, thanks for bringing that up, because that does confuse people. Yeah. So you do save person, optimistic happens right away, goes on the queue, starts on the server, is running. You hit delete person, optimistic stuff happens right away. So if you let them navigate away from the page, go and play with other things, right? They can play its nice, responsive, really fast thing. The delete hasn't even gone to the server yet. And until they hit something that blocks them for some reason, and this is why in Fulcro, like in this rad app here, when I hit save, the save button spins and it, it disables some of the other navigations until the save is complete, so that they can't get back here and say, oh yeah, and then I want to start playing with Joe and manipulate something that actually hasn't been persisted yet and create confusing conditions. Right? But you have to block that UI interaction explicitly because some applications might want that experience, right? They might want to come back here and just, disable these controls for Joe because they can see, yeah, Joe's not done yet. He's still got a temp ID. He's still new, right? But they want the user to be able to just like snap through the UI as fast as possible, right? So those are two different use cases. The snap as fast as possible through the UI is harder to code correctly, but Fulcro totally allows you to do it if that's the use case that you want and need. So, create your own headaches if you want, right? That's what you want. So back to our example here, if I save person, do optimistic, delete person, do optimistic, I'm waiting on the client queue. What's on the client queue is delete person ID, whatever the ID was. And over here, it's, I'm in the server and I've got person ID, some ID. But what if this server, we'll continue to the next line, returns temp IDs, ID, new ID. Right. So now we're ready. It's finished. It returned. I've remapped these IDs in Fulcro state, but I have to be careful because my delete person operation is in this client queue and it's got the wrong ID. Right. So if I were implementing this myself with, say, the new flag, right, that sort of thing, there's no way for me to easily reach in there and fix that. You'd have to actually add a plugin. You can, right? Everything in Fulcro is configurable, so you can actually you could reach into the transaction processing system, copy all that code into your own namespace, fiddle with the functions, tweak it so it handles your special way of doing new, and then it could work, right? But that's already been done for you, and so that's kind of the point. Is this is in the client queue, so when this temp IDs arrives, if it sees it, if Pathome hasn't filtered it out, then this guy in the queue gets rewritten so that now it goes to the start server with the right thing. And so now the delete can do the right thing with the right ID. Because if you delete with the temp ID, obviously the server's going to have no idea what you're talking about. There's one final case, and this was a case that I don't think I've got in the documentation anywhere, but somebody asked about on the channel the other day. And it's kind of difficult to explain these things in channel without taking an hour. And that's that if you do this, what happens? All right. So if you were to actually, I think what he was doing was he was adding a list. And he also wanted at the same time to add a list item. And what he had in here was like in list ID, there was a temp ID because it was a new list. Right. And he had various whatever parameters, right? You might have the item slash, value, hello, and this probably over here had a list, a list name of my list or whatever. You get the idea. Is I'm sending a transaction. What I'd like to do, let me clean up this ASCII art. What I'd like to do is combine those into a single transaction so that I've got these nice individual operations that I can kind of build up a transaction, say, okay, I'm simultaneously adding the list and adding an item to it. And the problem that he ran into was the temp ID rewriting. Well, when you do it like this, Fulcro tries its best to keep this atomic. That's a distributed system. Fulcro can't guarantee you this is going to be atomic, right? What it can do is it can guarantee you that both of those mutations will be sent to the same, if their remotes go to the same server, they'll go together. Then it's your responsibility on the server to enforce atomicity if you can. Right.
So they are both sent as a single request.
Well, let's talk about add list and add list item. Let's talk about how this is coded, right? Because here you could say Oh, not remote. Right. If that's the case, I can't send them both to the same server. They're not going to the same server, so they have to be split, right? But if you've coded it the way this would sanely be coded, right, they're both going to the same server. So this is part of the reason why the transaction processing of Fulcro, of any distributed application, it's a lot of thought. You really have to go through a lot of cases and think about exactly how things need to interact, especially when you want to talk to multiple servers. So the intention of Fulcro with kind of graph queries from the beginning has always been, wouldn't it be neat if you could just ask for this graph of data and have it magically assembled from wherever it needs to be assembled from, right? And we're getting pretty close to that. We're not fully there yet with Pathome 3. I think we're finally going to get there, because what you need for this to work completely is a combination of client-side parsers and server-side parsers in the remote. So the client can distribute the request across multiple places, reassemble it into one response. So you get this one unified response from federated data sources, right? Right now, the way you have to do it is you send the one request to the one server, it fans it out to any number of servers, reassembles it, and sends the response.
Yep.
But we're trying to move it one layer further out. So you're on the client and it can fan it out. And then those servers can further fan it out, and you can get data from, you know, every server in the world kind of simultaneously reassembled back into a nice graph that then you unify into the UI, and bam, right? You're moving. But back to the present issue here. So we're going to the same remote. So that's the caveat. And it makes sense we'd be going to the same remote because we're adding a list and then we're adding an item to that list. We probably don't have microservices so, you know, pimped out that one microservice holds list items and a different one holds lists, right? So that's reasonable. Now the intent, the hope here, what's you know, what we're trying to avoid is over here in our optimistic action when we add a list, and we add a sorry, this was list item. We want to do these two operations simultaneously for whatever reason. The hope is that we're not having to you know, write another mutation, add list with item, to do the two together, so that we can handle this. So let's talk about the various solutions to this. Solution one, right? This is one network request. So Fulcro doesn't have the opportunity to rewrite anything in this transaction. Once the transaction has arrived at the server has to process it. So there's no magic, right? Fulcro can't do anything for you at that point. Your server got it. You wrote your server. And if you used Pathome doesn't know anything about these. It's not going to fix this for you. It's just not going to work. So your choices here are, you could use a GUID, right? These will be processed in order. And so that would give you sort of an idempotent operation. What I've done at times, the temp IDs have a UUID in them. And that allows you to change your server mutations to be idempotent, right? So that add list can say, all right, I've got a temp ID. Do I already have that list's UUID from the temp ID? You just pull the UUID out of the temp ID with, I think, .-rep. I don't remember what the field is called on the temp ID, but you can actually pull the UUID out and say, do I have this UUID in my database? If so, I can just ignore this operation, because obviously all I need to do is return the temp ID remapping to the real ID, and I'm done, right? And then if this was written the same way, you know, for both of these IDs, really, then you're also one step closer to having, there's a namespace I wrote in Fulcro called durable mutations, I think, that I don't think hardly anybody knows about, that sort of does this same sort of mechanism. It's meant to keep trying mutations until they succeed, is basically what it does. But the only way that's safe to do is if your server side mutation is idempotent. So you even have to handle temp IDs idempotently with this sort of technique, right? So this is a mix of the two. This is a mix of, let's use temp IDs because Fulcro gives us these benefits when using temp IDs. But hey, there's a UUID inside the temp ID. So let's use that as the GUID solution to make the server side mutations idempotent. so that now I can solve this problem without having to invent yet another thing. Right. So it's actually already there. You can do it. You just have to, know to do that. The other thing you could do on the server, if you don't want to deal with the idempotent thing, is as you remap temp IDs, you could augment an atom in the env of the parser to say things I've remapped so far, and then just have a plugin do these substitutions in the request parameters for you, right? So you just do what, the part that Fulcro normally does in its plumbing layer, you could do in the Pathome plumbing layer. You could put a temp ID resolver plugin in Pathome that says if the first mutation returned temp IDs, then I'm going to look at the rest of the things that I'm going to parse here, and I'm going to change their query parameters, and I'm going to actually rewrite the AST so that any of those temp IDs that appear get rewritten. So that's the other way to kind of handle this. But once it reaches the server, it's kind of your responsibility. Although we could easily supply a plugin for people that would deal with this. We know the data type. It's a Fulcro temp ID. We can look at the AST. We can run, right? We can put a mutation plugin. We can make a mutation plugin for Pathome that adds to the env a temp ID resolver map at the beginning of parsing, and at each mutation step rewrites the rest of the stuff, temp ID rewriting. So that's another thing that we could supply that would help solve this problem for people. As you can see, it's a relatively complicated issue. You're in a distributed system, and creating new things is a complicated thing. there's inherent complexity. And even the GUID case requires you to do the work of look in my database to see that I have it before I do the operation. So nothing is just going to, completely fix this for you. But then the other thing you can do, right, which I think we told him on the channel. Oops, didn't mean splice. I meant split. How is that not working? Oh, I'm in the wrong place. There we go. Is if you want to do these two mutations as individual ones, we'll run them as separate transactions, because then the network queue solves this for you, right? Because this one sits on the client until the first one finishes, right? So instead of calling one transact with something you're saying, here's an atomic grouping of things I want to do, you call transact twice and leverage the fact that those will go in sequential order, and then this just works, right? No additional fiddling around. So that can be considered a documentation issue, right? Or a comprehension issue. I think it's in the documentation. All this stuff is documented. It's 300 pages of documentation, though. So it can be a little hard to find.
And hard to remember.
Yeah. So do you have questions, Jacob, that I could help clarify?
I think it's quite clear.
Yeah.
Maybe about Pathome. So when I send a single transaction with two mutations, does Pathome try to resolve them in order, one by one, or does it depend on if I use the parallel parser or sequential parser?
That's a question for Wilker, but I'm almost certain that the mutations run in the order they appear. If in the transaction, I can't imagine he would ever do anything else, because you have data dependencies between mutations sometimes, and so it doesn't make sense to not honor what the user asked for. But the EQL standard itself technically doesn't say anything about that. I don't think when we wrote that, I don't think we explicitly said that. We should, because of this, right? A given transaction may have related data and intention of order, and it's a vector. Vectors have a well-known order, so it should be honored. So I was going to show real quick what the patch is that fixes our problem here. Yeah, let's get rid of the whole comment block. Let's make sure that's compiling again. So I had intentionally broken this before starting. And so the global EQL transform is a function. This is rad app, I think. Yeah. So this is a function, and I have to reload the app to reinstall the remote to get that, or reinstall the middleware to get that installed. And I've got a copy of the function here just so we can see it. It's a function that, well, global EQL transform is a function that returns a function. This option requires this kind of function that takes an AST, so an EQL AST. And if you haven't seen those before, it's really a fairly trivial thing. Is this a CLJC file? No, it's a CLJS file. Yeah. So here, let me move our pictures out of the way here. So okay. So this is just like part of the EQL standard, and this actually came out of David Nolan's head originally. The OmNext AST is what we basically adopted and improved over time to turn into EQL, and it looks basically like the atomic pull syntax for the most part. And so if I have, for example, a query on a prop, then the AST of this is there's a root node, and then the children of that root are a prop named X. Right. And so maybe if I make a join in here, right? So now I've got the children are X, Y, and Z, but Z is a join, and his subquery is this query of A, which if you look at the children of this join, it's the property A. So it basically just generates a more machine readable, machine kind of manipulable AST. So that's what the global EQL transform hands you. Or I'm sorry, in Fulcro, it hands you an AST of the thing it's about to send. So if what you were about to send was a mutation, well, that comes out as type call. And if that was a mutation join, where you're asking for person ID, then the call will have children. Right. So what we want to do is we want to patch temp IDs onto that if it's not there. And so that's what we're doing. So we're saying, is the dispatch key of the AST, this is actually an AST node, so it's going to hand you, is that right? Root, children, dispatch key. I'm trying to remember if this is recursive, and I haven't looked at this in a while. No, it's just the top level. Yeah, I think the network, because it pops it down to the individual node, you get the node here. So if it's a mutation, we want to know if it has children. There's an additional bit to this where sometimes you don't want to send things to the server. Like if I say, UI open, right? I'll get an AST that's got UI open in that. And I don't want the server to have to look at that, because that'll give me errors like, hey, there's no resolver for UI open. And so that's how Fulcro strips those out. And you can actually manipulate that as well. As like if you decide you want, anything with UI in the namespace to be elided, you can do that, right? So we elide the things that want to be elided, and then Pathome returns its errors under this special key. So if you want those to make it to the client so the client can see them and react to them, you might want to add that to the children. And so this is basically saying for every AST, elide the things we don't want to send, update the children to include a node for the property Pathome errors, And then if it's a mutation, and this is the one that's broken in the built-in one for RAD even, if it's a mutation that doesn't have children, or it's not a mutation join, then we should add star to it so that it's asking for everything back from pathome, because we already added this guy. So there's already children. There's already a query. Yeah. Pathome's already going to filter everything out.
Right.
And so if there wasn't a return value from the mutation, and now we've added one, well, we better also add star so we don't break those people that think, well, I'm not writing mutation join with this. It should just, everything should end up back on Fulcro, right? So that's the a bug we need to, I mean, the fix is right here. I just haven't integrated it. And then if it's a mutation, obviously it has children, then we want to throw temp IDs on there so that we'll get the temp ID remappings. So once we define that, we install it, we come back here, we make a new one, and put in our various bits of required information. Oh, I think I already have a Bob, but let's just do a different Bob. Come on, Chrome. So we see in the database, we see some accounts. There's one account. It's got this temp ID. We save it and it rewrites. And if we look at the network, we see that the save form that we sent, even though RAD itself doesn't add anything to your query like temp IDs, we can see that the query included, the follow-on query included the pathome errors and the temp IDs. And so the response included the temp ID's key, which had the temp ID rewrites. There was a to1 in here, I think, that got saved as well for the address. Yeah, the primary address got remapped. So that's the other thing, is even though this was a save of multiple things, this guy had a temp ID as well that got remapped. Oh, sorry, that was account, not address. Address. Yeah, I didn't show that one, but if we were to go back to all accounts, get all the accounts, we say new, we get a temp ID in both those locations. So both of those were rewritten.
Yep.
All right. Was there anything else? I think that's all I can think of with respect to temp IDs.
I have one question, and that's okay. So if I send mutation join, pathome will filter out everything I have not asked for.
Correct.
Does Fulcro also sometimes filter out something? I guess it filters out the not found responses.
All right. Yeah, that's a whole different area, but yeah, it's related. Okay, so we could talk briefly about how the merges work. So if I send,
is that the only thing it filters out, or is there something else?
It's a little more complicated. It's a little more complicated, right? And this is another distributed system issue. Well, it's not just a distributed system issue. This is an artifact of the fact that we're using potentially more than one component in the UI that has different data needs to render the same thing. So we've got a perfect example here. I go into here, let's make this font a little smaller so it's not quite as. In this view, this is a person, right? If I look at Fulcro inspect here, I wish it was a little nicer about that. I grab, oh, I didn't preload the picker. If I were to look at this component, it has an ident of person/ID or account/ID, I guess. Right. So the information, let me just reload this so we have a clean database so we can see what's in the database, right? So what's loaded are these accounts, and the only facts that are loaded are the name, the ID, and the active, because that's all I need for this table. There's no reason to send a network request and get all the details of the count just to show this view. But when I click on one of these guys, let me click on Bob here, right? I want the network request to go over to the server. Come on, Bob, update. Were there two Bobs? Oh, that was the wrong Bob. Sorry. Bob with a capital B. Right? I want those details to come back, right? So in one case, right? So when I'm, let's go back to the network here and clear, and I say done. In one case, I'm running this query, and the response I want is the most up-to-date information of just those facts. But then when I click on this guy, it's a different query. It's really hard having the font this big. When I actually click on it, it's a different query. Come on. Right here, where I want all the information.
Yeah.
But the thing's already in the database. Okay. Now, so let's take a simplified example of this. So let's say we want person/name in one case, right? So this is in like the list view. And in the form, we need person name and person age, right? Those are the two possible ways we're going to ask for this information, whether it be via mutation join or a query. It's the same thing. The merge logic is identical. And let's make this maybe a detail view, right, where there's just more details. So let's think about this over time. So this is part of the reason I love Clojure so much, is it encourages programmers to think in terms of time, right? Like atoms, I've got this mutable thing, I've got datomic, I've got this database, it looks like this at this time, now it looks like this at this time, now, right? We've got these nice like snapshots of the world that are always really easy to reason about. But still, thinking over time, people aren't good at that. In fact, in my experience in my career spanning 30 plus years, that's been one of the things that I've really valued is whenever I work with people that understand how to think through time with respect to their software, because that's where 90% of the hard stuff is, right? That's where you run into problems. So when we just saw this time sequence here, right? Right here, I just queried for just the names. Well, what if somebody else over here had just changed Bob's name to Bobby, right? Let's actually do that. I mean, why not? We can just like open up. I don't need an incognito window. I don't need a new cookie. Let's just do it to ourselves. So let's open a new window, and let's go to accounts here. I don't want you, Zoom. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're on the accounts view here. I go into Bob, and I change. I've got a stupid validation on this form where your email address has to match your name. I change the name. Well, now this is out of date. But if I look in the database over here, I've got all the details about Bob here, right? And I might be on I might have a detail view or whatever. Like my loading story may or may not be conflated with my user interaction story, right? So I may load details at different times for different reasons. And in this particular case, I'm loading this report. All I'm going to load is names. But I might simultaneously on this same screen, maybe I've got a master detail view going, right? I reload this report and the detail view is showing. I don't want Bob's information to disappear, right? I want it to just update if anything is updated. So if I hit refresh here, if I rerun the report, did I save that? I did save that. Oh, that's a filter. That's not rerunning the report. I think I have to, there we go. So you saw it update there.
Yep.
So, but the network request was still just, I want the account name and the account, right? I just want the little details.
Yep.
But you see Bob's information still here.
Yep.
So what I sent to the server in this particular example, wherever my, I thought I had, yeah, right here. My detail view, in this case, my form, changed the name. So a new name happened somewhere else. But then in my list, I said, refresh this.
Yeah.
Right. And so what I'm getting back is just a map that has person name in it that I have to merge with the map in state that already has stuff.
Yes.
Right. And I don't want to do the naive thing and just replace it. If I just replace it, now all the other stuff disappears in the display. That's bad. That's a bad behavior. So I just want to merge the pieces that were asked for. Now go in the opposite direction, right? So now let's say this guy, well, it's not really opposite direction. You have to make it a little more complex. Let's say that someone cleared person name, right? So what I get back is an empty map from the server, right? So I said, show me the list, empty, person name's all I need. And it says, oh, I don't have any results for you, empty map. Do I clear person? No, I should only clear person name because that's the only fact that I asked for. So therefore it's the only fact that I know the truth about. And that's what the not found is about. So the processing of a response in Fulcro, because of this particular concern, is that it goes through every key that you asked for and merges. So you can think of it as, here's the original value. Person name was Bob. Person age was 40, and then the response we got was empty, and then the
okay, so the resolver on Python side returned person name nil.
Nil, yeah, it's just empty, right? So yeah, exactly. So what we do is we put the response in the middle here. We merge these where this map is generated based on what keys you asked for. Right. So this is what Fulcro's doing internally. Is it saying, here's what I've got in the database. Here was the network response. Here's a generated map that I'm going to make up, whose whole purpose in life is sorry, these are in the wrong order. And this is the trick is when you say nil out of Python, Python won't return you anything. So this is actually the response, right? So if the server returned person name Bobby, that's going to overwrite not found, which is then going to overwrite Bob. But if the server returns nothing, then not found is going to overwrite Bob. And then as a post step, I recursively walk the result of this merge and delete anything that has a not found value. Right? Because nil is the server saying it's actually nil. So I need to set it to nil, which is fine. Right? So if the server says person name is nil, then nil overwrites not found overwrites Bob. I get nil here. Right? And I'm sorry, the final result, I get person name nil, person age 40. But if the server says nothing about it, then I get not found. All right, sorry, this is Bob. Right, but if I didn't put this middle step in and the server said nothing about it, I'd still have Bob, which isn't true. Because I asked the server for person name and the server said, we don't have it anymore. Right, so this not found value is a special value that I'm using as a hack, basically. It's not really a hack, it's just a tool that I'm using to do this merge behavior so that values that you asked for, but the server didn't return, get properly removed. And if you mess with the middleware in the wrong way to where you don't strip out these not founds, pre-merge is where you can screw this up. So in the components, you can specify that pre-merge block, and pre-merge can see these not found values because pre-merge happens in between. It happens between where I do this trick and where I strip them back out, so that you can see what's supposed to be disappearing in the pre-merge. So that's where people usually see the not found indicators showing up in some weird way, is because they do something kind of messy with it and end up
breaking
this sort of mechanism.
Where does the not found marker come from? Because if the resolver actually returns name nil, then that's what I get in Fulcro.
Correct.
Right. But
correct.
If it doesn't return name at all, then Python will set that to not found, and that's what Fulcro will see.
No. Now, if Pathom sets it, no, Pathom should just elide it. So you're right. Pathom has a not found as well. So there's an additional layer of screwiness.
Okay, so there is Pathom not found and Fulcro not found.
Right. Yeah. So Pathom is supposed to, right? That's a Pathom thing. Yeah. So if Pathom, I always put in a plugin in Pathom that strips those out so that Pathom doesn't return not found to me on the client side. So you're right. Wilker added his own not found key for indicating the explicit condition when something is not found. And you can propagate those through to the client. And then that messes with your understanding of Fulcro's side of dealing with not found to correct this issue that has to do with two different query components querying for different parts of the same thing. Yeah, lovely. And there's not much I can do about that, right? I mean, you can use whatever you want on the server. Pathom is definitely what you want to use. But the fact that Pathom supports the idea of doing its own marking of these does create a little bit of additional confusion, because I've got a not found marker that has to do with a UI concern when doing server interaction. And he's got a not found marker that he's using because he doesn't only talk to Fulcro, right? Other people have to deal with this issue as well. You asked for it, you didn't get it. But I want to confirm that I understood you asked for it. Right? People get confused when you say, give me person name, and you just get nothing. You're like, well, I asked for person name. And so I think he got tired of hearing complaints about that. So he's just like, all right, well, by default, I'll put not found there. And then you can add a plugin to pull them out, which if you look in like the Pathom parser here, it's funny that you bring that up, because I forgot that was even there. Right. So I'm always installing that in Fulcro because I don't want Pathom's not found markers. I have my own.
Yeah.
And I trust that he's not going to return data that isn't there, which is what I want.
What happened to me is that I forgot to create a resolver and asked for it. And then Pathom returned Pathom errors with not found.
Yeah.
So that's what they sent me, but I couldn't see that in Fulcro because something has removed that.
Well, I mean, this would remove it, right? If you were using this,
I installed this plugin.
Yeah, because I think he's using his own key. Yeah, he's using his own namespaced key for not found. Yeah. So that should have propagated through to Fulcro. If you weren't stripping,
I need to check it a little more.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because those will be values, and values aren't stripped, right? So as long as it's got the correct key on it, it should have propagated through and shown up in Fulcro on the front end.
Okay, but that's good to understand that there is two kind of not founds.
Yep, there are.
One of those you are manually adding into the data you get from Pathom temporarily, and then you remove them again.
Yeah, and that's part of this Fulcro merge algorithm. Yeah, right. You can see the not found in here, nillify not found, which goes through and strips them, strips them back out. And this is the mark missing that walks through and tries to mark the things missing that were asked for but aren't there, right? So this is, I think Anthony D'Ambrosio wrote this particular algorithm. So if you look for the usages of mark missing, right, it's used all over the place. There's a lot of tests on it, actually, as most of the usages. So it's used in the merge algorithm, it's used in the mutations namespace, and it's used in the data fetch. And so you can just see like this one, right? So this is what is this one? This is the default. Oh, this is finish load. So loads are written via, right? Loads themselves are not a true primitive in Fulcro. They're actually a mutation, which you probably knew already. And so if you look for def method in this namespace, this is the actual load mutation from Fulcro's perspective. And the reason it's written as a def method instead of a def mutation is because I need to change the remote key section, right? And there's no way to do that with the def mutation macro, but the macro just emits a multi-method. So when you say def mutation internal load, it emits a function. I'm sorry. Yeah, it emits a function that takes an env and returns a map, where the map keys are things like action, result action, remote key, right? That sort of thing. So this is identical to writing, def mutation internal load with an action section, a result action section, and whatever you used as the remote as this section. And that's why it's a def method instead of a def mutation, is because you can't make this a variable in the macro.
Yeah.
So the load function transacts a load mutation, which you can override, right? You can actually specify in the app config which mutation you want to use to handle loads, right? That's configurable.
Yeah.
But if you use the built-in one, which is this multi-method, the result action, asks you how does it detect errors, and if it's an error, it calls the failed side, and if it's not an error, it calls the finished side. Well, the finished side removes load markers, right? It's really fairly straightforward. Like, okay, the load finished. If you asked for a marker, remove the load marker. If you specify an OK action in your load parameters, then I'm going to run the OK action. Otherwise, I'm going to take what I sent, right, the transmitted AST. I'm going to turn that back into a query. Or there's the middleware of your remote. You can actually, in the middle of the remote, change the transaction. So if you set the transaction as something, you can actually change what gets merged. That's a funky technique. Actually, I use it for file uploads. This is a really quick aside. So let's say you sent, you sent some mutation, and it's going to return, some value, that you want to stick in the Fulcro app database, but for whatever reason you didn't want to use a mutation join, right? What you can do is you can install a piece of middleware that says, oh, well, if it's function F, then I'll put transaction in the result as a query for X so that I'll get it processed properly. So you can actually use the middleware of the remote to change. This is also useful if you're talking to JSON servers, right? You were sent some parameters. You turned that into a query for JSON, sent it, got back a map of JSON, turned that into closure data, and now you want to merge that into state. You can actually, at your remote, change what transaction it looks like you sent so that it can get merged and normalized. So that's why that's there. So it gets the query, it runs this mark missing thing. So that's that part where it's basically using that technique I told you, where it's looking to see, did I get it? Did I not get it? Did I ask for it? Put not missing, or not found in there. It merges that into state, runs your post mutation, and somewhere in here does the target processing. And I think one layer up, or maybe it's in merge star actually. Oh, right, it's got to be in merge star. So what I've got now is a body. I've got a response that has not found markers on it. And so then this guy takes that map that has the not found markers on it and merges it into the state via normalization. So it's kind of, it's like finding the right spot to put everything in the database. And as one of the final things it does, it does this sweep merge, and sweep merge recursively, merges things in properly and removes the not found keys. So it sweeps, right? Requires the source has been marked via marked missing, And the reason it's called sweep merge is it sweeps all the not founds back out as it's doing that merge operation.
Yep.
Right. So I don't know, couple of interesting tidbits there that you can define exactly how you want load to work. And so this is where, right, the post mutations happen off of a load, post actions happen, et cetera. But it's just a mutation that overrides the result action of mutations. That clear it up? Clear everything up? All right.
Thank you.
Okay, what other fun things did you want to talk about? Anything?
Nothing I have on my mind now. I think I get a lot of stuff to process about the temp IDs.
Yeah.
What do you propose to integrate into the default global transform the setting of temp IDs and so on?
Yeah,
that sounds very reasonable.
I guess since the Fulcro rad template overrides the global one, it probably needs to be put there. But we probably should also go into Fulcro itself and change the default.
I was wondering, why do you override it in rad instead of just composing it with your custom rad modifications?
That's true. That would probably be a better thing to do, is pull the default, because I mean, you're just stacking functions, right? You could have the first one work and then run the second one, and that would be all right. The trick then is you'd have to be careful to check if temp IDs had already been added by the user, by the prior stages. So it gets a little more complicated to compose them because they're all adding, right? And so you wouldn't want to add the same thing twice. I guess it wouldn't hurt anything because you get a returned map and the keys are distinct. So it really wouldn't break anything to have it twice. So yeah, I think those are the two action items. Is in regular Fulcro, we should modify the default EQL transform to include this logic, which it currently doesn't.
And maybe the path and core errors as well are quite useful. Yes.
Yeah, probably. I mean, most people are going to use Pathom. I mean, I always do, and most everybody else always does. So why not? I try not to tie Fulcro itself to external libraries, but Pathom is such a critical one that, and that keyword, it's not going to hurt anything to have that keyword going over the wire. So yeah, we should just do that. And if we do that, then we don't have to install a customization in RAD at all. Although I think
you exclude some more namespaces in RAD than just the UI one.
You're right. I think the elision predicate, we look for UI in the, there's a whole blacklist you can pass. Yeah, so you're right. That might make more sense.
Reusing the Fulcro proper global transform, right?
Actually, yeah, a lot of these should be in the normal default blacklist for Fulcro. Like, you shouldn't be sending UISM stuff. The active remotes shouldn't be going. The data fetch marker table, the form state configs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we might want to expand the default blacklist in Fulcro. And I don't know, it wouldn't hurt anything to go ahead and include the rad ones. I mean, there's keywords.
Right.
All right. So yeah, I'm game for all of those. Any that you feel like doing.
Okay. I guess I will write an issue and get to implementing it.
Cool. Yeah. Have I added you to the Fulcro project as a collaborator so you can manipulate issues?
I am not sure.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
And see you online.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. Bye.